The Northern Pacific Line ran like clockwork through the Cascade Mountains, a serpentine route that had operated without incident for 37 years. Train 447, the overnight freight passenger hybrid, departed Seattle at 11:47 p.m. every Tuesday and Thursday, arriving in Spokane at 6:23 a.m. the following morning. In all those years, it had never been more than 12 minutes late. On the night of March 15, 1984, it arrived exactly on schedule. But the engineer was gone. Robert Kellerman had worked for Northern Pacific for 19 years. At 42, he was known among his colleagues as methodical, reserved, and unfailingly punctual. He lived alone in a modest apartment in Seattle's Fremont neighborhood, drove a 10-year-old Chevrolet, and spent his weekends fishing on Lake Washington. His personnel file contained nothing but commendations. His medical records showed perfect health. His bank accounts revealed a man who lived well within his means. He was, by every measure, unremarkable. The evening of March 15 began as it always did. Kellerman arrived at King Street Station at 10:30 p.m., 90 minutes before departure. He performed his standard pre-flight inspection of locomotive 4471, a General Electric U-30C diesel-electric that he'd operated dozens of times before. The maintenance logs showed he'd signed off on fuel levels, brake pressure, and communication systems at 10:52 p.m. Station Supervisor Margaret Chen saw him in the dispatch office at 11:15 p.m., reviewing the route manifest. She would later tell investigators that he seemed normal, maybe a little quiet, but that was Bob. He'd accepted the clipboard with the night's cargo list, 42 freight cars carrying lumber, machinery parts, and 3 passenger cars with 17 souls aboard, and returned it with his signature. At 11:39 p.m., conductor James Whitmore performed the final walk-around. He knocked on the cabin door. Kellerman opened it, nodded, and gave the thumbs up. Everything was ready. At 11:47 p.m., Train 447 pulled out of Seattle, disappearing into the rain-soaked darkness of the Pacific Northwest. For the next 6 hours and 36 minutes, it operated flawlessly. The route through the Cascades was a marvel of engineering, cutting through mountain passes and alongside steep ravines. The line included 47 bridges, 12 tunnels, and required constant attention from the engineer. Unlike modern computer-assisted systems, the 1984 control setup demanded manual throttle adjustments, brake applications, and vigilant monitoring of signals and track conditions. Yet Train 447 navigated every curve, every grade, every signal with textbook precision. At 12:43 a.m., it passed through North Bend right on schedule. The automated signal system recorded the train's passage. A night watchman at the crossing noted nothing unusual. At 2:17 a.m., it slowed appropriately for the climb through Snoqualmie Pass, maintaining the exact speed required by the gradient. At 3:55 a.m., it stopped at Ellensburg for a scheduled 7-minute service pause. Conductor Whitmore walked the length of the train, checking cargo doors and passenger car connections. He didn't enter the engineer's cabin, there was no reason to. The train was performing perfectly. At 4:02 a.m., Train 447 departed Ellensburg. At 5:48 a.m., it began its final approach into Spokane, decelerating smoothly through the suburban stations. At 6:23 a.m., it glided into Spokane Union Station and came to a complete stop at Platform 3, its brakes hissing in the early morning silence. Conductor Whitmore stepped down, clipboard in hand, and walked toward the locomotive to complete the arrival protocol. He knocked on the cabin door. No response. He knocked again, louder. Silence. He tried the handle. The door was unlocked. It swung open easily. The cabin was empty. The initial response was confusion, not alarm. Whitmore checked the bathroom compartment, a cramped closet-sized space behind the cabin. Empty. He walked the length of the train, thinking perhaps Kellerman had stepped out during the Ellensburg stop and moved to one of the passenger cars. The 17 passengers were interviewed within the hour. None had seen the engineer. Station police were called at 6:47 a.m. By 8 a.m., the Washington State Patrol had been notified. By noon, the FBI had opened a file. The investigation that followed was exhaustive. Every inch of Train 447 was examined. The locomotive cabin showed no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, no scuff marks suggesting a physical altercation. Kellerman's thermos sat on the small shelf beside the controls, still half full of coffee. His lunch pail was tucked beneath the seat, containing an uneaten sandwich wrapped in wax paper. His jacket hung on the hook behind the door. The control logs told a strange story. The throttle, brake, and signal records, automatically stamped onto a continuous paper roll, showed that someone had operated the train with expert precision for the entire route. Every speed adjustment, every brake application, every response to track signals had been executed flawlessly, exactly as Kellerman would have done it. But there was no evidence of anyone else being in that cabin. The passenger cars yielded nothing. The 17 travelers, 12 in coach, 5 in the sleeping compartment, had seen nothing unusual. Most had been asleep. Those who were awake had been reading or looking out at the dark landscape. None had walked through the train. None had seen anyone moving between cars. The freight cars were sealed and showed no signs of tampering. Their cargo manifests matched perfectly with what arrived in Spokane. Investigators turned their attention to the route itself. Could Kellerman have jumped from the train? The question seemed absurd. Train 447 had maintained an average speed of 47 miles per hour through mountainous terrain in complete darkness. Jumping would have meant certain death or severe injury. Yet teams scoured the entire route, walking the tracks, searching ravines, examining every bridge and tunnel. They found nothing. No body. No clothing. No disturbance in the trackside vegetation. Could he have climbed out at one of the crossings? The train had passed through 63 crossings between Seattle and Spokane. Each one was investigated. None of the automated crossing gates had malfunctioned. Their timing records showed Train 447 passing at full speed, no slowing, no stopping. Several crossings had night watchmen or happened to have late-night drivers waiting. None reported seeing anyone climb from the locomotive. The Ellensburg stop became the focus of intense scrutiny. During the 7-minute pause, Conductor Whitmore had been at the rear of the train. The station was unstaffed at that hour. Security footage, grainy black and white from a single camera covering the platform, showed the train arriving and departing. The angle didn't capture the locomotive cabin clearly, but frame-by-frame analysis revealed no figure descending or climbing aboard. Could Kellerman have exited on the opposite side, away from the platform? Investigators walked the area. The opposite side of the locomotive faced an empty rail yard with excellent sight lines. A freight supervisor had been working in a nearby warehouse with windows overlooking the yard. He stated firmly that he'd seen the train arrive, pause, and depart. He'd seen no one. The timeline was maddening. Someone had operated Train 447 with professional expertise for 6 hours and 36 minutes. That someone had responded correctly to track signals, navigated complex terrain, and brought the train into Spokane exactly on schedule. Yet that someone had vanished without trace, leaving behind a locked mystery that defied logical explanation. The FBI's investigation expanded outward, searching for motive. Robert Kellerman's life was dissected with forensic precision. Bank records going back 15 years revealed a man who saved modestly and spent little. There were no large withdrawals, no suspicious transfers, no hidden accounts. His apartment was searched top to bottom. Investigators found exactly what they expected: a tidy, sparse living space containing fishing gear, a small television, a bookshelf with technical manuals and paperback mysteries, and a meticulously organized collection of railway maps. His personal relationships were examined. Kellerman had no family, his parents had died in a car accident in 1971, and he was an only child. He'd never married. His few friends described him as pleasant but private, someone who preferred solitude to socializing. There was no girlfriend, no secret lover, no hidden life. His work history showed steady, unremarkable progression. He'd started as a brakeman in 1965, advanced to fireman in 1968, and earned his engineer certification in 1972. Every performance review praised his technical skill and reliability. He'd never been disciplined, never called in sick without cause, never showed up late. There was no gambling debt, no blackmail, no political radicalization, no religious conversion. His reading material was innocuous. His phone records showed brief, infrequent calls to colleagues about shift schedules. His medical records revealed no diagnosis that might explain sudden mental breakdown. The man had no reason to disappear. Yet he had. Theories proliferated. Some investigators believed Kellerman had suffered a sudden psychotic episode, opening the cabin door and stepping into darkness while the train was in motion, his body swept into a ravine or river where it might never be found. But this theory struggled against the operational records. The train had been operated expertly until the moment of arrival. If Kellerman had experienced mental collapse, who had driven the train? Others suggested a sophisticated murder. Perhaps someone had hidden in the locomotive before departure, killed Kellerman, operated the train to Spokane, and escaped in the confusion of arrival. But this required explaining how a killer could have boarded unseen, hidden in a cabin that contained no hiding places, operated complex machinery with professional expertise, and departed without leaving any physical evidence whatsoever. A few voices suggested something more elaborate, that Kellerman had planned his disappearance, that he'd somehow arranged for someone else to be in the cabin all along, that the two had switched places at some point during the journey. But when? How? The Ellensburg stop was too short and too observed. The moving train offered no opportunity for such a switch. Months passed. The investigation continued but began to lose momentum. The file grew thick with reports that led nowhere. The public's attention drifted to other mysteries. By the end of 1984, the case of Robert Kellerman had become one of those unsolved enigmas that occasionally resurfaces in true crime magazines, a strange, inexplicable vanishing that defied rational explanation. The file was never officially closed, but it gathered dust. In 2019, 35 years after Train 447 arrived in Spokane without its engineer, the Northern Pacific Historical Society began a restoration project. Locomotive 4471 had been retired in 1993 and stored in a railway museum outside Tacoma. A team of volunteers, many of them retired railway workers, undertook the painstaking work of returning the old diesel-electric to operational condition. It was a labor of love, driven by nostalgia for an era when trains were operated by human hands rather than computers. Among the volunteers was Thomas Chen, a retired railway engineer who had worked the same routes as Robert Kellerman, though they'd never met. Chen had been part of the original 1984 investigation team, a junior conductor asked to examine the locomotive's mechanical systems for any anomalies. On a Saturday afternoon in October 2019, Chen was working inside the cabin, cleaning decades of accumulated grime from the control panels. He was alone, the museum quiet, autumn light filtering through the dusty windows. He was wiping down the underside of the control console when his cloth snagged on something. He knelt down, peering into the narrow gap between the console and the cabin floor. Something was wedged there, deliberately placed in a location invisible unless you were looking for it. Chen retrieved a flathead screwdriver and carefully worked the object free. It was a small brass plate, roughly 3 inches by 2 inches, tarnished but intact. Engraved on its surface in neat, professional lettering were 4 lines. "This train runs itself. If you know how to ask." The answer is in the asking. RK. Chen sat back on his heels, the plate heavy in his palm. He immediately contacted the FBI's Seattle field office. The case, dormant for 3.5 decades, suddenly sparked back to life. The brass plate was analyzed by forensic specialists. The engraving was done with professional tools, likely in the weeks before Kellerman's disappearance. The metal itself dated to the early 1980s. Fingerprint analysis revealed only Kellerman's prints, along with Chen's more recent ones. But it was the message itself that reopened every question the original investigation had failed to answer. This train runs itself if you know how to ask. Investigators revisited the control logs from March 15, 1984. They brought in modern railway engineers, experts in 1980s locomotive systems, and retired operators who had worked on similar equipment. What they discovered was both remarkable and frustrating. The General Electric U-30C locomotive, while requiring manual operation, had several automated safety systems designed to prevent operator error. If an engineer failed to respond to certain signals, the train would automatically begin emergency braking procedures. If an engineer released the dead man switch, a pedal or lever that required constant pressure, the train would shut down. But these systems weren't foolproof. They were designed around the assumption that an engineer was present but had become incapacitated. They weren't designed to prevent an engineer from deliberately gaming the system. A sufficiently knowledgeable operator could, in theory, set up a series of automated responses that would allow the train to operate for an extended period without direct human intervention. Throttle locks, brake timers, signal bypass protocols, all were possible if you knew the systems intimately and had time to prepare. Robert Kellerman had known these systems intimately. He'd operated them for 12 years. The route from Seattle to Spokane was one he'd run dozens of times. He would have known every signal, every grade, every curve. He would have known the exact timing required to navigate the route successfully. Had Kellerman spent weeks, perhaps months, learning how to automate the journey? Had he tested his theory on shorter runs, making small adjustments, perfecting the technique? Had he finally, on March 15, 1984, put his plan into action? If so, when had he left the train? The reinvestigation focused on a detail that had been noted but not fully explored in 1984. Train 447 had passed through a maintenance depot 7 miles outside Seattle, a facility where trains occasionally stop for quick mechanical checks. On March 15, there had been no scheduled stop. Train 447 simply passed through at reduced speed due to track work in the area. The depot had been staffed that night by a single maintenance worker, Gerald Hoskins, who had passed away in 2003. His original statement to investigators had been brief: he'd seen train 447 pass through around midnight, nothing unusual. But in 2019, investigators tracked down Hoskins' personal journals, preserved by his daughter. In an entry dated March 16, 1984, Hoskins had written something he'd never mentioned to authorities. Saw the Seattle overnight go through last night. Thought I saw someone walking near the tracks after it passed, but when I looked again, nobody there. Probably just tired eyes. 7 miles outside Seattle. Minutes after departure. A figure near the tracks. If Kellerman had exited there, he would have been in an area he knew well, with access to roads, and with the entire night to disappear before anyone realized he was gone. He could have walked to a prearranged vehicle, driven away, and vanished into a life he'd carefully prepared. But this raised the central question: why? The 2019 reinvestigation found no new evidence of financial motive, personal crisis, or external pressure. Kellerman's life before March 15, 1984, remained as unremarkable as it had seemed 35 years earlier. Yet the brass plate suggested something else: pride. Intellectual satisfaction. The pleasure of solving an impossible puzzle. The answer is in the asking. Investigators debated the meaning. Some believed it referred to the automation itself, that the answer to operating a train without an operator was in understanding how to ask the machinery to do what you wanted. Others thought it was more philosophical, a statement about the nature of disappearance itself, that the only way to truly vanish was to make people ask the wrong questions. The 1984 investigation had asked, how did he leave the moving train? Perhaps the better question was, when did he leave the stopped train, and how did he make us believe it was still moving with him inside? The case remains open. In 2020, the FBI released a statement acknowledging the discovery of the brass plate and requesting any information about Robert Kellerman's whereabouts. If still alive, he would be 78 years old. No one came forward. Searches of international databases, social security records, and border crossing logs from 1984 onward revealed nothing. If Kellerman had assumed a new identity, he'd done so with remarkable skill, leaving no digital footprint, no paper trail, no trace. The brass plate is now housed in the FBI's Seattle field office, catalogued as evidence in an unsolved disappearance. Locomotive 4471 was successfully restored and now operates tourist runs through the Cascades, a working museum piece that carries passengers along the same route it traveled that night in 1984. The volunteers who operate it sometimes share the story of Robert Kellerman with curious visitors. They point out the control console, explain how the automated systems work, and describe the technical brilliance that would have been required to execute such a plan. But they can never answer the question that lingers over the entire mystery: what would drive a man with no apparent problems, no debts, no enemies, and no grand ambitions to orchestrate such an elaborate disappearance? Some suggest Kellerman simply wanted to prove he could do it, that he'd seen a puzzle in the mechanical systems he operated every day and couldn't resist solving it. That the disappearance wasn't about escaping something but about achieving something, the perfect vanishing act. Others believe there was a life we never uncovered, a motivation so carefully hidden that decades of investigation couldn't reveal it. Perhaps Kellerman had a secret that made his old life unbearable. Perhaps he'd been planning his escape for years, preparing an identity and a future we simply haven't found. Or perhaps the truth is simpler and stranger, that Robert Kellerman looked at his quiet, predictable life and decided to become a mystery instead of a man. That he chose to be remembered as an enigma rather than forgotten as ordinary. In the end, we're left with what we've always had: a train that arrived on time, a cabin that stood empty, and a brass plate that asks more questions than it answers. This train runs itself if you know how to ask. The answer is in the asking. Somewhere, perhaps, Robert Kellerman is reading about the reinvestigation, about the discovery of his brass plate, about the theories and speculation that continue 35 years after he stepped into the darkness. Perhaps he's smiling. Perhaps he's satisfied that the mystery has endured, that the answer remains hidden in plain sight, visible only to those who know how to ask the right question. The train runs on schedule. It always has. But the engineer is still gone.